I mean, Stan Grof, coined the term holotropic, and most people associate that just with breathing. Specifically hyperventilatory breathing.
Okay.
But really, it just means moving towards wholeness.
Okay.
So he distinguishes. It's actually a qualifier.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have a psychedelic experience that is holotropic. You can also have one that's psychotic or neurotic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is a healing movement. You can do a breathwork session. You could do travel. You could do prayer or song or art, and that can be holotropic or not. So I think decoupling it from lying on the floor breathing fast is really neat, because you're like, oh, what ecstatic experiences, those that take us outside ourselves, are holotropic, that move us towards wholeness.
Yeah. My name is Jason Silva, and this is Flow Sessions. Flow Sessions is a series of mind-stretching conversations exploring the intersection of culture, art, technology, and altered states of consciousness. What does it mean to be human in an age of rapid change? What is the future of psychotherapy and mental health? What role will technologies play in our cultural evolution? What are the cognitive benefits of awe and wonder? Flow Sessions is presented by Flowcana, California's leading sustainable cannabis brand, working with independent craft farmers to transform agriculture the California way. Jamie Wheal is the co-author of the global best-selling book Stealing Fire. He is the executive director of the Flow Genome Project and a leading expert in the neurophysiology of human performance. His work combines a background in expeditionary education, wilderness medicine, and surf rescue, with over a decade of advising high-growth companies on strategy, execution, and leadership. Jamie's coaching ranges from Fortune 500 companies like Cisco, Google, and Nike to the U.S. Naval War College and Red Bull. Jamie Wheal is an absolute genius. You guys are going to love this episode. Please welcome Jamie Wheal. Jamie Wheal.
Hey, man.
Welcome to Flow Sessions.
Stoked to be here.
That's what we've called it. In honor, of course, of not just, the state of flow, but our sponsor, Flowcana. But, we're all aching for more flow in our lives. So I thought it'd be an appropriate title for these conversations. It's great to have you here, man.
Yeah.
How are you?
Great.
Amazing. Well, to start things off, I first came across your work a number of years ago and was instantly infatuated with many of your ideas. I remember it was a TEDx talk from Black Rock City in Burning Man, and I was immediately hooked by the title. It was called From Altered States to Altered Traits, Hacking the Flow State. And without even watching it, I just kind of felt like the title it just spoke to me immediately, because so many of the moments that have defined my life, the moments that take my breath away, the moments I remember with fondness, have been moments that occur in altered states of consciousness, mythopoetic states of rhapsody and reverie. And, before I learned about flow and about you, we tended to think of these states as haphazard. They show up when they show up, and we have no say over staging their preconditions. And yet, with your TEDx talk, even with the title, the whole idea that we could go from altered states to altered traits told me that maybe there's something to be learned about, like, changing parts of ourselves to more readily access these sacred states, and that spoke to me. So for those listening, would you mind kind of going into the basic thesis behind that wonderful treatise, From Altered States to Altered Traits?
Sure.
Great.
And also full hat to Houston Smith, who was a famed scholar of religion. He was part of the Good Friday experiments, and then finished his career. He was at MIT and was in that world, and then made his way to Berkeley. Wrote the Book of World Religions, which is one of the more famous kind of coffee table books of just high level, but also kind of from an initiate's point of view, survey of the world's religions. And so that phrase of how, or that question, how can we move from altered states to altered traits, is one of his. And in fact, one of the maybe lately, there's somebody that's taken over the lead, but for decades, the most cited academic article in psychedelic literature was his, and it was "Do Drugs Have Religious Import?" And
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So just before we begin, full hat tip to Houston Smith.
Love it. Well, it's funny you mention him, because was he the guy that said, you ended the talk, and before we get into it, you ended the talk with a marvelous quote. And I don't know if it was Houston Smith, but I think it was, where you said, and this means essentially the same thing as from altered states to altered traits. You said, how might we turn our passing illuminations into abiding light?
Yeah.
Is that him?
Yeah.
Okay, so then I get it now. So his whole thing, from altered states to altered traits, is summed up in the poetry of that quote as well. How might we turn our passing illuminations into abiding light? Because therein lies my real engagement, my interest in so much of the ideas that you help put into the world. Is, do we have the creative capacity, the agency, the prowess to turn these passing illuminations, these moments that make it all worthwhile, but that tend to be few and far between for most people, into abiding light? I mean, what are we talking about here? The hacking of consciousness, a kind of ecstatic transhumanism. I mean, so take us on this journey of turning our illuminations into abiding light. I mean, how did you kind of fall into this, and what is the main argument there?
Well, I mean, gosh, I'll come at it from like my own just bumbling efforts into the space.
I love it.
Because for me, it was just survival skills. It was just, what on earth was better than default normal? Just start with that, right? And, in high school, maybe it was like getting hammered and driving down the road and playing like mailbox baseball with an axe because we couldn't find a baseball bat, like just whatever. Just like, I will look to break this world rather than be confined in it.
Oh, say that again, because that's beautiful. I will look to break this world rather than be confined in it.
Yeah. I guess that just came out, but you know what I mean? Like,
dude, I mean, this is a wonderful essay called "The Death of Awe in the Age of Awesome," written by a guy called Henry Wisemeyer, and he had a line. He said, "As spirituality wanes, experience is the new faith, and we are refugees from the mundane." And that sounds pretty similar to your, I guess, sensibilities, like looking for something beyond the default world, so to speak.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And for me, it was a very simple kind of triumvirate of, music, mountains, and mushrooms. You could throw in another M, like throw in marijuana, like as a state shifter.
Sure.
Endocannabinoid system, well-being, enhanced pattern recognition, and especially combining them. Don't do this at home, kids. But basically, every surfer, every skier, every snowboarder, like we all know the jam. Shift state, prime yourself, and then go surf gravity in the natural sublime. Shit works. And even better, and then on your off nights, when the moon is full and the band's in town, like the community gets together and throws down to improvisational, ecstatic music. Rinse, wash, repeat.
Rinse, wash, repeat.
Yeah. And so for me, that was like, this is where meaning seems to arise, at least for me. Natural sublime, psychedelics with deep companions, right? And the music of, what is derisively called jam bands, but starting with the Grateful Dead lineage that came out of Kesey and the Pranksters, right, was the original postmodern ecstatic technology, and Joseph Campbell acknowledged it because you guys are, with Bill Moyers, he was like, hey, you guys as a band are effectively a modern day Rite of Eleusis.
Really? Yeah. Joseph Campbell?
Yeah, wow. 100%, full hat tip.
Whoa.
And if you think about it, you're like, okay, that is actually, the emerging gobbledygook of the Grateful Dead, right? That started out as basically a jug band / blues band, but they were on high dose acid, and so was their audience. And Jerry Garcia, the guitarist and sort of charismatic lead of the band, they all noticed that they were creating something, and it was something beyond the playlist, and it was something beyond the notes, and that there was a feedback loop between a psychedelically enhanced crowd at the acid tests and the musicians and the music. And they, to their credit, didn't try and bottle that lightning. And no one claimed the ring, right? No one said, and he refused. He actually constantly gave it back. He's like, I will not steer this thing. And it killed him, ultimately, like the burden of that. But they figured out a way to create a coherent field of novel emergence that was highly embodied, deeply ecstatic, and salvific, because the Zen koans. I mean, I was just listening driving here, actually, because I, Sirius radio in the rental car, right? I turned on the Grateful Dead, and it was, I ain't often right, but I've never been wrong. Seldom turns out the way it does in the song, right? And once in a while, you can get shown the light in the strangest of places if you look at it right. And their song canon is littered with phrases like that. And you could see them showing up as psychedelic koans, as living scripture. They would show up on T-shirts. There would be Calvin and Hobbes. There would be, like the Dancing Bears. There would be varying mashup iconography with these living scriptural lines that you knew, because you'd experienced it yourself, as had tens of thousands of others, that in that moment, in the second set, where the moon was rising and that song dropped and it went all the way down into people's living systems, that was what Joe Campbell was talking about when he was talking about a rite of Eleusis, and the idea that not only was it a fucking good time, like, if you think about like rave culture, it's just oods, 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 oods. I was juiced to the gills, rolling my face off, and I felt great, and I loved everybody. But there was no wisdom imparted. There's very rarely lyrics, and if they were somewhat pat, right? But Robert Hunter, who was the lyricist for the Dead, was a scion of a San Francisco literary family, deeply steeped in culture, deeply steeped in mythology, deeply steeped in Old Testament, New Testament, Arthurian legends, Western mythologies, all of it. So that became a carrier, basically a carrier vessel for a sort of Western, hermetic, trickster-based cosmology. That's just fucking fascinating.
Yeah.
And you can then say, and that begat Burning Man, which has done a similar thing in the sense of refusing to name the thing.
Refusing to name the thing.
And allowing a lot of mess.
Interesting. Well, but okay, so refusing to name the thing, but even though we don't name the thing, we know that there is a thing, and that thing can heal us of our fractures. And it sounds like, you early on found an equation or a set of triggers, guidelines, elements that allowed you to pierce through to the spaces beyond normal, or the states north of happy. So if we were to go back to our initial question of turning our passing illuminations into abiding light, the question is, of course, why must we do this? Why is our default state to begin with not enough? Today we're living in a epidemic of mental health that's going on, mental health crisis. I think a United Nations number I came across said that more people are committing suicide than are dying from natural disasters and armed conflict combined.
Yeah.
So, for all of the fear and the media and the doom and gloom and the terrorist attacks and the this and that, it's really the number one danger really is your own brain, your own demons, your own fracturings. And what is the worm at the core of the human condition to begin with that makes it so that we have no choice but to find the keys to the kingdom somehow and turn these passing illuminations into abiding light, these altered states into altered traits? Do you think it has to do with, the whole Ernest Becker psychoanalytical take on the human condition, that it is simply our awareness of being mortal beings that haunts our dreams and makes it fundamentally intolerable? That the only response to the human condition, according to Becker, is full and open psychosis. We are naked and trembling before the cosmos. We, Sheldon Solomon says, breathing pieces of defecating meat destined to die and ultimately no more significant than a lizard or a potato. So on one literal grid level, right, we are these finite beings that age and die, but we are endowed with imaginations and cosmologies that allow us to contemplate infinity. And so there's the dissonance between what we can marvel at and what we can conceive and engender in our minds with the reality of aging and death is what makes the fundamental disquiet of the human condition, the worm at the core. So it's like, essentially, we either find a goddamn way of turning our passing illuminations into abiding light, or we fucking kill ourselves. Yeah. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, pretty much. Like that is 100% half of the game.
Half of the game. Okay.
You know, and you know, I know you know this quote as well. I think we shared it before, but that Nisargadatta one of you know, wisdom tells me I'm nothing. So that's the decomposing zoo animal.
Yeah.
Love tells me I'm everything. And between these two banks flows the river of my life.
Isn't that beautiful?
Isn't that
beautiful? Isn't language beautiful? Yeah. I mean, therein lies the problem.
That's it.
But it's not even what that means. Because of course, what it means is it makes perfect sense, right? Like wisdom tells me I am nothing, love tells me I am everything, and in between those two banks is my life. Like that. That's true. But you know what's also beyond measure is the elegance of that language, the poetry of that phrase, the fact that we can concoct something so beautiful to find respite from our ills, you know, that we turn to language, that we turn to poetry, that we turn to the mythopoetic to find a relief from this burden of being able to ponder the infinite, seemingly capable of anything, but to be housed in, you know, in Becker's words, these heart-pumping, breath-gasping, decaying bodies. I mean, it's almost like, I mean, I agree with you. We got to find something beyond the normal.
Yeah.
And you seem to have found this equation. And I guess, tell us a little bit about the practical approaches to, did you say music, mushrooms, and
mountains?
And mountains. You know, what is the neurobiology behind why we respond to these states? What does the science tell us about our capacity to pre-construct and to design for these ecstasies that take us out of time and outside of the default setting of mortality awareness, anxiety, and the fibrillating, what do you call it, the cul-de-sacs and error messages of the nagging mind, you know? Like, let's tell, because I think it's interesting for people to realize that, you know, you are aware of the science and the research and the application and the reproducibility and the reliability behind evoking these states of, what do you call them, the trifecta of ecstasis, catharsis, and communitas, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that was a later add-on. Like at first, I was just really interested in those peak states.
Yes.
And then what would happen, you know, thinking, hey, standing up on top of the mountaintop, being able to look at the world below, that perspective shift, super helpful.
Yeah.
And then you go back and shoulder your pack down in the forest, but you know your destination. You've got a lock on it. You have faith. You're not just like, why are we doing this, and when will we get there?
Right. Because you've had a glimpse of the promised land, so you can go back to fetching water and chopping wood with equanimity.
100%. And I think we were talking about this earlier, but you also end up with a somatic marker, like a felt sense in your body, you know? And
that's important.
Right, which is the opposite of our trauma. So we have a sense of wholeness, even if it's fleeting, even if it's brief, and it becomes a lodestone, right? It becomes a reason to keep going.
Lodestone for the restless mind.
And then ideally, you know, and so this gets back to the passing versus abiding, you know, like how do we go from flashes in the pan to actually living a life of purpose that integrates these things? Because there's a reason why there's been a lot of social opprobrium against them and about them. It tends to lead to bohemian excesses, slackness of will, you know.
We don't want that either.
And confused thinking. So there's always been a don't go, you know, there be dragons, come back inside the walls.
Sure.
Right? So my sense is that...
Yeah, or once you get up the message, hang up the phone. Isn't that
the number of
quote?
Things, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of like, ideally, we can stitch together our peak experiences with our waking life, and we can literally, you know, kind of basically you're taking your peaks and you're plowing them into your valleys, and then you end up with a higher plateau. Because there is a sense of, you know,
that makes sense.
In mountaineering, there's a death zone, right? Above 26,000 feet, we ain't supposed to be there.
Right.
Right. And you can go there, but you can't live there for long.
Right.
And so that sense is, it is down in the valleys that our homes, that our children, that our families, that our farms are. That's where life is.
Yeah, for sure.
And so and yet there is nothing like sunrise
on the top of the mountain,
looking over an entire snowpacked mountain range and being the only humans for miles. Right? It puts you right with the world.
There's so much grace and so much poetry in that. And let me ask you about this phrase you talk about, the somatic knowing. Mm-hmm. Is that sounds to me a little bit like felt experience. Yeah, there's a felt experience. Because I read a marvelous article called it was on Aeon magazine by a guy called Chris Letheby. He's a philosopher of science or philosopher of mind out of Australia, and he talks about how psychedelics, psychedelic therapy or psychedelics work by violating our expectations of reality. So by giving us an experience that violates our default understanding of the way things are. Mm-hmm. We are mortal beings. Life is inherently meaningless. We die. But that psychedelics, or any experience of an altered state, standing on the summit of the mountain, at the top of the mountain at sunrise, these kinds of experiences seem to provide us with an encounter that seems to violate that previous literal grid interpretation of what we are. It gives us another place to plant our feet, another way of seeing things. His language is that these kinds of ecstatic experiences provide knowledge by acquaintance versus knowledge by description. So you can take a person with treatment-resistant depression, or just an existentialist who is depressed over the fact that we are mortal beings, and you could tell him with words, hey, dude, there's another perspective here. There's another way of seeing who and what we are, another interpretive framework that actually won't cause you such disquiet, and you can tell him that. But he's still depressed, right? Because he's still seeing the world through those lenses of perception, that prism of expectation that is coloring his world. That's knowledge by description. It doesn't get through. Sure. But knowledge by acquaintance is the equivalent of picking them up and putting them physically on the top of that mountain at sunrise. And that knowledge by acquaintance is essentially that somatic experience. It's felt in the body, right? It's an experience of what Werner Herzog might call ecstatic truth. Essentially, we're talking about the domain of religious inspiration or divination, but it matters not whether the content of that experience meets empirical reality standards. What matters is, according to this article, the epistemic value of those experiences. Yeah. In that when you come down from the mountain, you are now more willing to serve your community. You're more inspired. Your trait openness can shift a whole level. You're no longer depressed. That's why these psychedelic psychotherapies are so breathtakingly effective, seemingly, in curing people of the pathologies of mind.
Although I want to actually challenge on some of that. Some of that late research.
Of course, but what do you think of this idea then? Of this notion of the knowledge by acquaintance versus the knowledge by description? That there lies the...
I mean, Zora Neale Hurston, right? Famously back in the 20s, said you got to go there to know there.
That's exactly right.
That's it.
I love how you just took like 4.5 minutes of me trying to explain this essay to you. You were like, yeah. You got to go there to know there. That's exactly right.
That's it.
Exactly right.
And then, because life is a grind, there's good chunks of it that is in that chop wood, carry water, bust ass. And it wears us down. As Rocky Balboa, the great philosopher, said, it'll beat you to your knees. Right? So we do have to have places where we can stand tall, where we can stretch our bones, where we can set down our loads, if only for a moment, and go, oh, fuck yeah, this is me at full height, full strength, with vision. And we're resilient creatures. We are hardwired to do the right thing, the good thing. We're hardwired to grow and connect and serve. It's just that the grind can beat us down. And so the ability from time to time, right, to set our burden down. Like glory, glory, hallelujah, right, when I lay my burden down. And that's a beautiful thing. And so, I don't think we need much. We don't need to overindulge. And to go back to the, early research on the psychedelic therapies and the breakthroughs. And I'm, 100% in favor and support of that work and having that provide access and hope to people who have been suffering treatment-resistant trauma, depression, anxiety, all of that. And we are quite likely on the tippity top of a hype cycle of the early, most breathless reporting, right? Because for any, if psychedelics were that much of a magic bullet, then the baby boomers would all be like Jedi High Council instead of crispy librarians, right? And so we have to like measure this, that clearly the first few experiences are asymmetrically impactful because they literally just go from default 21st century normal, trapped in my monkey suit, to, hey, psst,
top of the mountain.
There's more. There's more. And so just that move from, I thought this was all there was, to having a somatic experience, a felt experience of, there's actually a whole lot more, that is profound and life-changing. But it does not absolve us of navigating the human condition in that expanded landscape. It doesn't provide a helicopter ride back to the summit. Right? We just know it's there.
We just know it's there. And somatic means in the body.
Yeah.
Right? So having a somatic experience, which, in the words of Chris Letheby, an experience of knowledge by acquaintance, like being directly acquainted, being placed on the top of the mountain at sunrise versus being told that there's a beautiful mountain that you can
like armchair mountaineers reading their National Geographic.
Yeah, exactly. That a somatic experience functions essentially in the same way as trauma does. One of the most interesting takes on how trauma can inform our lives was written by David Lenson in his book on the phenomenology of altered states on drugs, where he says that an experience of like perpetual anxiety or acute anxiety, like people who suffer from panic disorder, for example, are experiencing a kind of temporal dislocation. Temporal dislocation. So they're not being here now.
Yeah.
In fact, what happened is, according to him, that an early trauma, so it's a negatively impacting somatic experience in the body, right? An early trauma is now over judging or over perceiving the present. The past experience, right, is brought to the doorstep of every moment and informing your perception of every moment. It's like PTSD, right? Every moment feels dangerous, even when clearly it's not. But you bring that sense of danger, that hypervigilance, because of that somatic past trauma, to the doorstep of every moment. And in turn, conjure up a future that becomes identified with doom. And both, I think, depression and anxiety are both experiences where the person is not able to meet the present directly, but is negatively preconfiguring everything that's happening because of that negative somatic experience. So here's where it gets interesting. So that's trauma. And you could argue that just being born and becoming aware of mortality is an early somatic trauma. But Roland Griffiths out of Johns Hopkins University, he's doing the psilocybin trials to treat people with death anxiety related to cancer. He likens a positively impactful mystical experience mediated by mushrooms in this case that meets all the criteria of William James, the mystical experience questionnaire. Like the deeper the mystical experience, it ends up functioning as an inverse PTSD. So also somatic, but positively so.
Yeah.
And just like trauma on a somatic level ends up having all these negative consequences in your life when you go back to the day-to-day, the positive inverse PT experience, seeing the light, having the encounter, the knowledge by acquaintance on the top of the mountain, ends up being a somatic experience that's positive. Yeah. So that when you come back into the valley of the everyday, as you say, you meet every day with a little more grace, a little more kindness, a little more patience, a little more empathy. And that seems to be enough to get by.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And I mean, my sense is like, basically any of these ineffable states, from flow states to mystical states, et cetera, tend to occur temporally in, what researchers would call like the deep now. So it's kind of a quintessence of being where you're just 100% absorbed, and it feels not just that it's the present moment, but it's almost sort of everywhere, every when,
yes,
all at once.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And in the sort of like Gnostic Christian tradition, that's like the intersection, like the mystic interpretation of the cross is Kairos Chronos, right? And the idea of sacred time is the vertical axis, axis mundi, forever and always. And and Chronos is clock time, our little piddling lives, right? And we're normally on that horizontal axis. But if we do our homework and we're lucky one day, we end up at that intersection. And there is, like, for the Rosicrucians, right, is the rosy cross of Christ consciousness, which is I am aware of my eternal nature and being at the same time that I am yoked to the mortal coil. And that is that blissfuck crucifixion, right? It is both exquisite and agonizing. And I think a lot of the overly optimistic, kind of, transformational culture, psychedelic renaissance bubble is buying into the idea that we can kind of get off the mortal coil, that we can somehow dodge or solve the human condition. And best as I can tell, that's a fool's errand. The harder we struggle against it, the stronger the snapback.
Interesting.
And
so
the
you
beatdown is. Right.
Okay.
So for me, it would be that, and I think I remember actually.
Can we do both?
Which bit?
Well, can we find the grace and the equanimity of Chronos and Kairos while still actively working to develop new therapies, new technologies, new medicine to extend life and extend our health span and so on and so forth? I mean,
I think we're off the hook.
Yeah.
Off the hook for our neurotic Woody Allens and a life of meaningless fucking, surfaces. We're off that hook. Like, that's solvable.
Okay.
But the cost is we're on the cross, right? Can we actually be awake and aware of the totality of the human experience without flinching and without contracting our aperture? And that's that blissfuck crucifixion piece. Like, it is exquisite and it is obliterating. And most folks don't want to sign up for that, actually.
Well, it's a lot to ask.
I want to skim the cream. I don't want to churn the butter.
Well,
right?
I do understand what you're saying, and there's so much poetry, of course, in what you're saying. But
it's also super practical. Like love someone. Like, every single marriage ends in at least one person broken and grieving. At least 100% of marriages. It's either divorce or it's you're burying your partner. And yet we all get back up to that altar and say, till death do we part, I promise. Right? That is hope eternal. Like, raise children. And if you do a great job, they leave the door. You give them 2 decades of your life and they leave, if you've done it right, and don't look back. Bury your parents and find that giant wheel of the mortal coil ratcheting one step forward, and you're now on the sharp end. See it all, right? I mean, like the human experience is irreducibly filled with grief, but it can be something that we experience as beautiful and profound, and a privilege to be present for, or it can be that rage against the dying, the light.
Well, which is, I think, is equally romantic, by the way.
I think we fucking do it all, like, of course.
And well, exactly. I mean, look, everything you're saying resonates with me and sounds like, the closing lines of the most magnificent play that I've ever watched. I mean, it's beautiful, but, like, what I think is equally beautiful is our capacity to say, right, to exercise our will in saying, I didn't sign up for these terms. And
for sure.
And we've doubled the human lifespan. We're about to turn biology into a programmable medium. Health and medicine are going to be, like, upended and transformed. Already the things that we engender in the world are of a level of complexity that, seems inconceivable to me in some ways. And you have some philosophers like Kevin Kelly, from Wired Magazine, who says that the things that we engender in the world, our tools and technologies, are actually extensions of our biology. And he describes this almost
extropic or anti-entropic move towards greater complexity and organization in the form of our tools and technologies. He says we're smack in the middle between the born and the made, and we're going to create artificial minds. And why shouldn't mortality just be something else to be overcome, just like we overcame gravity with our aircrafts, or we overcame distance and geography with our smartphones? You know, when I hear Amber Case describe a telephone call as a technosocial wormhole where consciousnesses can meet each other and fold space and time, essentially, I think to myself, well, I mean, if we can do that, then we can do anything. I mean, this, you know, what did Terence McKenna say? We are the coral reef-like animal, or the extruder of technological material. We take in matter of low organization, we put it through the filters of the mind, and we extrude something like this. Why can't we extrude ever longer lifespans? Why can't we extrude non-biological minds? I mean, as magnificent as the bliss of crucifixion is, there is a part of me that wants to, or needs to believe, that there is more to us than that.
There's two roads to go down on that.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Right. So to your point on
and I could just be a little kid who's scared of death, but I still think there's something beautiful about us saying, like, we will never fucking give in, you know, like, here we are, and what the fuck, you know, like.
Yeah. But, so now there's several forks in this wonderful conversation. So one is to go with Kevin and his point, right? That all of our tools are really just extensions of us, as well as our ability to transcend the apparent limitations of hidebound mortality.
Yeah.
Okay. And I would agree in the sense that I think we are wildly, I mean, I forget who this was, but it was in the conversation around Elon Musk and AI and living in a simulation. Yeah. And it was someone just basically saying, why are we carbon-based chauvinists? Like, what's wrong with silicon intelligence? Like, why do we think that carbon-based life forms somehow have privilege?
There you go.
Right? So that's question one. And the other is anthropocentric consciousness. Like, why do we locate ourselves in carbon-based primates as the center of the universe? I mean, no surprise why we have. Right. But now we're smart enough to know better. Yeah. Like dolphins to AI to, aspen forest to fungal networks. You're like, there's a lot of ways information is exchanged, processed, and acted on by a whole bunch of different organisms.
Yes.
So just pan off our anthropocentrism for a second. You're like, yeah, probably. There's all kinds of different ways. And even the nominal extinction of the human race, if it were an adaptation of starseed consciousness uploaded to computers that self-propagate and do whatever, neat. And we played our part, right?
Yeah. Maybe that's pretty fucking amazing, dude. It's not just neat.
There would be some mourning, right, in the transitions. A good old Schumpeterian creative destruction's a bitch to be on the sharp end of, right? But maybe so, right? And there could be a yielding or relaxing, right? So let's say that's us. That's still us in some form of agency over our own transitioning into what's next. Yeah. Right. And then back to this, the whole, the theme we've laid out so far of why bother with peak states? What's their value? Yeah. The passing illuminations to abiding light. Yeah. And then Kairos Chronos. Yeah. Right. So it appears, and I don't, all I can say is, what was your description? It was the term, it was affective? What was the way of?
Somatic. Oh, knowledge by acquaintance.
Acquaintance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, if and as we are lucky enough, fortunate enough to stumble into that intersection of Kairos and Chronos, often and more than once, and let's call it the garden, right? Let's just say it's that Edenic
Garden of Eden,
right? That Edenic paradise that lives outside of time. The Grail Castle, the loving cup. Yeah,
for me, it's the climactic moment in my favorite music. It's the cathartic peak of the song.
Yeah. And what is the cost of admission, right? The cost of admission is everything you thought you were and all your pain and all your stories. So it's ego death.
That's very true.
You do not pass the veil, right? unless you are stripped to your essential being. Okay. So you have experienced that dying unto all my preferences, my pleasure, my pain, my stories, my yearnings, my longings, my pride, my fears, right? And then you enter the garden and you're like, oh shit. Past, present, future, it's all arising, it's all perfect. Yeah. And you can maybe even apprehend this all works out.
This all
fucking works out. Amazing. So now what do? Right? We come back to waking state 3D, right? The fever dream fades. Here we are, just, Dorothy waking up back on the phone.
Yeah.
But we know, we're like, oh, I've seen the end of the movie.
Yeah.
I read the last page of the book.
Yeah.
So now and this is the Eleusinian mystery thing, right? It was a death cult. It was an ecstatic death cult. It taught you how to die. And once you've already died, right, then you come back immortal. So now I know how the movie ends. I'm back in my meat suit, but I've shouldered that suit willingly this time. And now I know in my bones that I am simply living out the middle chapters of the greatest story ever told.
So these kinds of experiences of ego death, this knowledge by acquaintance, this glimpse of the promised land, this access to Eden, in F. Scott Fitzgerald's line, he says these transitory enchanted moments in which man must have held his breath, compelled into aesthetic contemplations he barely understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder, which I adore. What you're saying then is that at the end of the movie, experientially and perceptually, time falls away, space, time, and mind collapse into one wonderful, ecstatic, cathartic merger, union, omega point, and then all these questions, they all become just badly posed questions in the end. Like, because we, in this absolution, it's almost like a divination, but like, something happens that makes everything else fall away and none of it ultimately matters.
Yeah, it's like that old joke about you don't ever find the answer to the meaning of the universe. You just stop asking the fucking question. Right? Yeah. And so like that death rebirth is what in the esoteric traditions was like gnosis. Right? The sense of like, oh, I was walking along thinking I was me, thinking I was whole. Yeah. I realized I wasn't. That was a cardboard cutout. Now I've actually been initiated into a profound embodied knowing and a remembering. Because I mean, there's always those moments in peak states of anamnesis, of that forgetting of the forgetting, and remembering what I had forgotten. And I always think of like that Disney movie is like Sleeping Beauty, where like the entire kingdom is asleep and there's thickets and brambles, and then the prince comes and love's true kiss, and everyone wakes up midstream. Back in the enchanted world, right? And I mean, that is a persistent phenomenon that people experience of like, oh shit, I remember. In fact, not only do I remember the thing I swore that is so central and so true, but I also remember the last time I was here and had access to it.
Do you think that what is felt in those moments also, you lose your individuality, so you have you are all and all is you. You are everyone and everyone is you. Is that a qualitative feature of the experience? Because what just occurred to me when you were describing this is one of the things I've always wondered about is the phenomena, the subjective phenomena of becoming engrossed in a film. So when you're watching a movie, there was this wonderful article by Diana Slattery where she was talking about immersion, and she was talking about like absolute unmixed attention, immersion, being fully immersed, essentially disappearing into that which you are beholding, as Terence McKenna says, becoming what you behold. Immersion is a prerequisite for any interpersonal experience of transformation, education, or persuasion to take place. And she was talking about what happens, let's say, when you lose yourself, you lose your sense of self in a story. There's something called the deictic shift. The deictic shift is the moment in watching a movie where you now assume the viewpoint of the character. So you're no longer a person in the theater looking at the screen. Now you're actually inside the character looking out through his eyes. Like phenomenologically, subjectively, you have this felt experience. You assume the viewpoint of the character. And, it's hard to keep that dream stable. You can easily be distracted and pop back into yourself if somebody turns on a cell phone in the movie theater. But there is a period of time in which you assume the viewpoint of that character and you undergo, in this Kairos-like space inside the movie theater, you undergo the hero's journey. You undergo his journey. You have the bliss fuck crucifixion. You submit, and then you die, and then you are reborn. I mean, a religious experience can happen just inside of watching a movie. But I guess my question has always been like, I take great comfort in these moments because I have an experience that's real, but that didn't happen to me. But that's real.
Yeah, and so you get in the learning laps. without having the wear and tear.
Sure. Okay. So maybe yeah, but I wouldn't even call it cheating. But I was saying, do you think that that's like an intimation, or I mean, it's an experience that in itself shows you that things can happen to you without you being there? Does that make sense? So like the anxiety about one's body and one's aging and one's death, like that doesn't matter when you're watching a movie and you've become that character, because that character, you're in an archetypal realm. And that character is you, and you are that character, and that character is everyone, and you are now in a mythopoetic archetypal space.
Yeah, there's been some interesting research on that, and like even just adult readers of fiction versus nonfiction, and the folks that read fiction with complex character development, crisis, etc., everything you're talking about, actually develop greater emotional intelligence and resiliency, and express less anxiety and depression. So we get to work ourselves out, right, via imaginal, shadowing, right, of fictive characters, which is rad.
Yeah, and imaginal shadowing of fictive characters. I mean, that's I remember reading Rich Doyle's book when he was talking about dreams, or in this case, waking dreams. Like when you watch films, it's a waking dream. He says dreams do not lack reality; they are real patterns of information.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's still a real event. I guess what I'm speculating about here is merging with the character on screen is just one example, or one intimation, or one invitation to consider the ways in which there is more to us than just the meat suit and the monkey mind.
Yeah, well, exactly.
That we ourselves can become liminal beings. That experiences can happen in consciousness where time dilates, space-time gets inverted, like that there are these domains. It doesn't have to be psychedelics. It can just be like watching a freaking film that really sucked you in. That show you what is through the looking glass. Yeah.
Any number of things.
Yeah, that pierce through the looking glass in some ways,
Yeah. I mean, Stan Groff, coined the term holotropic, and most people associate that just with breathing. Specifically hyperventilatory breathing.
Okay.
But really it just means moving towards wholeness. Okay. So he distinguishes, it's actually a qualifier. So you can have a psychedelic experience that is holotropic. You can also have one that's psychotic or neurotic, right? So that is a healing movement. You can do a breathwork session. You could do travel. You could do prayer or song or art, and that can be holotropic or not. So I think decoupling it from lying on the floor breathing fast is really neat, because you're like, oh, what ecstatic experiences, those that take us outside ourselves, are holotropic, that move us towards wholeness. Yeah. Right. And so my inquiry there, I mean, there is that notion when you're talking about dreams being legitimate and having their own organizing information, as do fictive film or song.
Yeah.
That gets to the role of the value of peak states, in the sense that, we are a monophasic culture that has one channel of acknowledged reality.
That's right.
5 senses empirical.
That's right.
Rationalist.
That's right.
Post-French Enlightenment, right? And scientific method. And everything else is suspect. It's also why the psychedelic Renaissance has made headway as medical interventions. And
for our monophasic culture.
Fuck yeah. And like
medical interventions for monophasic culture.
And ketamine works because of the GABA receptors, and it has this uptick in depression. Never mind the K-hole. Let's not talk about that and where people go, right? We're going to talk about GABA receptors, and we're not going to talk about psilocybin in the sense of it's connecting you with whatever branches of non-ordinary reality it might. Right, we're saying, hey, serotonin.
Default mode network gets shot down.
And it's a great fucking card game.
Well, it's a great card. We need that literal grid for now, because it is the operating principle on which most of us are moving. I think it would be too disruptive if we didn't
If we told them about the bats, right? Like, when are we going to tell them about the bats? And so, like, there's a legit question, which is it's like Stranger Things. It's like any of our stories.
Yeah.
What happens when the cat gets out of the bag? When Schrodinger's cat gets out of the bag.
Yeah.
And then we start actually living into a world that does not behave the way the old one was supposed to.
Wow. You think we'll ever be able to surf those domains to become like jujitsu masters of those domains without getting locked up in a padded room or losing our way? Like, it's just because, I take great comfort from ecstasis, from going beyond myself. With I'm very susceptible to trance when I watch movies. I disappear, and that's why I cling to them the way people cling to the cross, because I'm like, that movie's like, I hold it close to my heart because it's taken me to different domains. It's exposed me to aesthetic orgasms. I've lost myself and found myself surfing that cinematic wave, right? That Gene Youngblood in Expanded Cinema says cinema reflects mankind's historical capacity or desire to manifest his consciousness outside of his mind in front of his eyes. Consciousness meets its own process when we lose ourselves in a film. Hugo Merstenberg in 1912, when writing about the photoplay, said cinema, right, actually mimics consciousness more than it mimics empirical reality. That's why we didn't have to be taught to watch films. The close-up represents attention, the flashback represents memory, the foreshadowing represents future modeling. So consciousness works more like a movie than like empirical reality. So we meet ourselves there. We know that space because that's a kind of ecstatic space. At least it has been for me. But I don't doubt that psychedelic experiences, or for you, mountains, mushrooms, and the Grateful Dead were also encounters with domains where you weren't there, or you were more than you. And then all the anxieties of the human condition fall away, essentially, right?
Yeah, but there was actually something about the interrelationship of those things that I think is important and gets to the question of integration, right? And the passing illuminations becoming abiding.
Yeah. So what do you do when you leave the movie theater? What do you do when the concert's over? What do you do when the lights come back up?
For sure. And so integration application is ultimately scoreboard. The sort of the difference between an alchemist and an addict, right, is the score. And either you were engaging in that process. And that is why, we accidentally, ended up in grad school in Boulder, plugged into the very vibrant, extreme sports, mountaineering, guiding, backcountry skiing, etc., plus the tag into the Alpha Hippies, a lot of the McKenna Brothers crew, right? And that world. And it had been a high watermark as the Reagan Thatcher years and everything else had kind of come and swept away the earlier Renaissance. That was where it lived. It lived in Telluride and Crested Butte and Boulder, right? Okay. And there were mountain throwdowns and hoedowns and everybody was turned on. But during the daytime, people calibrated and tested their metal. So compared to hippies on the West Coast, they could just lounge around and play hobbits in the woods and nothing would ever gut check, right? It was, hey, you're in an avalanche zone, you might die today. Hey, you need your wilderness medical training. Get your shit together. Hey, if you're hypothermic, if you go wandering around in your Birkenstocks, you're going to get lost and get cold and die. So there was a sharp end and a facing. Basically, it was the element of Kali, right? It was actually facing mortality. And people in those communities died every single season. Right? We lost, we attend funerals and, lost dozens of friends and colleagues to rockfall, avalanches, whitewater drownings. This was the real shit. And so to combine those experiences with communitas, with celebration and live music, with beautiful natural places, and with gravity and its consequences, right? And therefore having to level up into awake, aware, capable, responsible humans. Right. That piece is missing. I didn't realize how lucky we were is the bottom line. Because we were lucky.
How lucky you were you didn't die?
No, there was a number of close calls, but lucky, and people have so many preconceptions about the Grateful Dead. Interesting, lucky to be initiated into the Arcana Americana, right? The living scriptures of the gospel, folk, blues, and then psychedelic music traditions, because it was a profoundly living scripture. And
I think cinema is that for me.
But what it did is no one in the mountains, no one is part of that community, ever ran off and joined a guru cult. None of them ever succumbed to soft and fuzzy thinking. This is pre-Instagram, internet marketing, a bunch of things. But people were humble. Yeah. And the more badass you were, the less you talked or promoted it. Everybody tested their mettle against true life and death. Yeah. Everyone then had their peak ecstatic experiences in God's cathedral with their brothers and sisters, and it became an amazingly focused crucible for raising high-performing, homegrown humans. And so Beautiful. It's only lately, as I've been trying to assess transformational culture, Burning Man culture, psychedelic renaissance, and being what's missing? Why are we doing these dumbass things right now? That I've retrospectively come to profoundly appreciate
the way you grew up.
The culture we got initiated into just by the by.
So, yeah. So in bringing that back then, because we've gone off the deep end so beautifully. Turning our passing illuminations into abiding light, integrating this glimpse of wholeness so that we can, in your words, turn our leaky buckets into chalices and render ourselves whole. Can you just spend the last couple of minutes real quick on, practical applications that we thankfully have? Like what's happening in psychology, technology, neurobiology, pharmacology, the four forces of ecstasy that is giving us this unique capacity now to steward our access to these ecstatic and information-rich states, and then contending with those states, bringing that back, integrating it into our wholeness, so that we may, do a better job at being humans and scale access to these domains that can heal us of our fractures, because we so badly need to in this fucking mental health crisis epidemic.
Yeah, for sure. All right, ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So in a nutshell,
the
ecstasis, the peak state, tends to remind us of what we forgot and gives us a sense of completion, wholeness, beauty.
Yes.
And it also gives us our laundry list of shit we haven't figured out yet. It's basically like an electrician running a voltmeter through our nervous systems, and you're like, oh, you're banged up here, you're contracted here. It might be a physical injury from the past, it might be an emotional wound, it might be whatever it is, right? But we could tend to get staggeringly clear readouts of all the places that energy does not move cleanly through our system.
Okay.
Right? So back to the abiding light, or the holes in our colander. We get a punch list. Here's all your holes, buddy. So now I can either come back down and be like, okay, that's my homework. And now I can engage in dedicated practice to start patching my holes. And I actually have, good material, because I still have the light and the inspiration, right? The
afterglow.
The afterglow. And so I'm a little bit more courageous. I'm a little less contracted.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I can use that light to kind of fill in some of my holes. And
do your homework.
Yeah. And in connection, in communitas, means am I doing this in service for you, for us? Does this deepen our connection? Does this further our goals? And that's a wheel. Like that experience of ecstasis, catharsis, communitas is forever rolling us forward through our lives, right? And some of those practices are dead simple. Like how do we turn our colander into a chalice? So the simplest is just like upgrade our nervous system.
Upgrade our nervous system.
Bottom line, because then the next time you have a jolt of light, you don't blow all your fuses and melt your wiring.
Right.
So you don't do the manic depressive. Like either I'm a golden god or fucking nothing matters.
Right. Because that's what's too much of that in like some of the Burning Man bliss junkie culture, where it's like, pay the price of admission, have 3 days of high ecstasis, and then like 3 weeks of depression, and then start planning for next year instead of
exactly. So basically most folks out of the box, like 21st century zoo animals, we are only running things cognitively. Right. So if you suddenly introduce peak states into someone who's living behind their eyes, it's basically like giving the hamster wheel of your mind, like giving that little fucker a shot of crystal meth. Right. And now he just goes even faster, and you can't handle that energy just in your brain. That's right. In your mind, in your stories. You will short all those circuits. So you have to bring it down into your body. And you do that with breath, you do that with movement, you do that with spinal articulation, pelvic mobility, like functional movement, monkey shit, as well as awareness of respiration and its integration with vagal nerve tone, right? And the ability to move brainwave states skillfully. So I can be hyper-focused in high-functioning beta, I can be more relaxed and expansive. In alpha, I can become deeply contemplative in theta, right? And so I do that via respiration, movement, including, as I said, fascia and attention to vagal nerve tone. Then sexuality, just sexual fitness as a baseline, because it's the most strongly encoded evolutionary driver we have. So and it's responsible for most of our suffering and trauma, by accidentally including babies. Like, hey, you rub your bits together, it's fucking awesome. Oh, joke's on you guys, 9 months later you have a kid, right? Yeah. That is a bitch slap of evolution. And McKenna talked about the stoned ape, right? Being the article of how we got to being Homo sapiens, like eating mushrooms back then. I think it's more like the horned ape. It's actually our ability to mate outside of estrus, right? And to perpetuate prolonged sexuality that is the unlocking move. It's unlike any other primates, and there's only like 2 or 3 other animal species in the entire world that even remotely approximate what we do. So include that, and then include music, because it even predates language and is one of the most potent state shifters. And then finally, substances as sacraments. How do I shift state skillfully? And like that suite is what we can use to take the information from our peak states
and integrate
and integrate our trauma, and then connect, test, apply, and refine in relationship with others.
Beautiful.
And if we do that, then we have a shot. Right? We have a shot at living into the better angels of our nature.
Yeah.
Right.
Which I love that idea. Well, it sounds like these tools and techniques, these technologies, this applied knowledge gives us a way of metabolizing the passing illuminations. And in metabolizing them, we become them. There's a great essay I once read about epigenetics, right? And one of the scientists said something like, our cells can be or are a technology that turns experience into biology. So when I hear you, metaphor, but sort of not really, right? Like that's epigenetic. We become our experiences, or we are the sum of our experiences. So when I hear you talk about all of these body exercises and the nervous system assimilation, the vagal nerve stuff. I'm paraphrasing what you were saying so eloquently, but that's a way of kind of doing the thing that helps us to metabolize into the body those passing illuminations, so that those passing illuminations become part of they become instantiated, downloaded into our bodies, and so they end up living that metaphor. Our cells become this technology that turns these experiences into biology. We become the light. And then it's that Nisargadatta line you told me, the other world is this world rightly seen, right? Because once we metabolize that fully, well then, shit, man, then that default world is no longer, because now we see the North Star, right? We've seen the light.
It is life and practice as the yoga of becoming.
Amen. Jamie Wheal, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for your time, brother. Appreciate you.